Hello guys, welcome back. This is Re69 with another video. It's been a while, but life happens. So, we got a pretty cool list today. It's a variant of Buildmar. For those of you who are unaware with that term, it refers to a Magmar build that focuses on its build minions, notably Biomimetic Hulk and Gigaloth. It was piloted to great success. I'm not the first one to come up with an idea like this. It was piloted with great success by the Meltdown Town guys, particularly Monk Business and Dalbaz, back in Team Wars, and has been also featured by Wimpish on his channel. There'll be a link in the description. But both of those used starhorn decks, which is good because they had a draw engine built in just by virtue of starhorn. But one of the things I noticed is they were building like a standard Magmar deck in that they ran rebukes, which are incredible with a 0-10 structure, right? You don't lose anything, the opponent can have his board wiped. And then your Gigaloth comes online the next turn. So very powerful swing turns, plenty of draw. But the more I thought about it, the more I was wondering if there was a more aggressive build that can be exploited, namely with Ragnora. Largely because of all the ramp this deck runs, you can play it like a swarm deck. It's really not a combo deck so much as a swarm deck. And it's all about how you start, and if you put enough bodies on the board, you'll just run your opponent over. So this is where this deck came in. I experimented with my brother TM25MD while I was on holiday, and we ended up settling on this list. I think the only difference between the list I run and the list we were testing back in the day is the old list ran Reliquarian over Bounded Life Force, which I'll explain the change later. So yeah, this is my view and my interpretation of Buildmar. I consider it stronger than the previous Starhorn versions simply because it combines, the oppressive, tempo-positive plays that Ragnora can put down with, the further oppressiveness of dropping body after body in your opponent's face until they finally, just can't answer it. And, lose to a Gigaloth that just buffs your entire board. So why don't we go through a couple of the deck choices, some of the cards that I decided to put in, and that'll give you, I think, a more streamlined view as to why I think this deck is a little better than the Starhorn versions that came before them. A huge shout out to the original innovators who, got the first curve down. They far and away did most of the work. I really was just refining an already powerful list. All right. So our two drops, nothing special. We got 11 twos, so pretty good. We're usually not going to miss our turn one play. Kuhada for ramp. Rescue RX. Fantastic card, even if it's not really that big on stats. Can really slow down tempo and aggro, because they know they can't really go in on you in the first couple turns of the game if you open with this, just because you will delete most of the damage that they do. 5 healing is no slouch, and it's often enough to win you the game. Biomimetic Hulk, totally busted card. I have no idea why CBG printed something like this. 2 mana, 10/10, build 3, but you have cards like Timekeeper existing. Yeah, that's not okay. With Kuhada, it costs 1 mana. Literally as player 2, there have been times where, you can open Kuhada, double Hulk, and, rescue RX. And, you'll deny center and, the tile of the first player if they played a 2-drop. Just way too strong, because a lot of times, the strength of this deck is you can put out a lot of big minions before some of the bigger removal, notably Plasma Storm and Blood of Air / Sandswell Reader can come online just by grabbing all the mana tile like a typical Swarm deck and really making those 5-mana removal plays, too late, a turn too late, just because, the player really, Blood of Airing a Gigaloth isn't going to do much when the board already has +3/+3, or, you've got everything else in the face. And then, of course, you can just follow up with it dropping another Gigaloth in their face. And usually that tempo negative game, coupled with, developing Ragnora's BBS, is just too much, and the opponent wastes too much resources dealing with your board. You never lose the initiative, and they lose in the late game because they can no longer answer your threats. So moving up to the 3-slot. 3-slot's a little scant, and I think it's by far the weakest part of this curve. You got T2K5, which is a great draw engine on its own, particularly when comboed with the likes of Spelljammer and even the 2-drops, particularly RX and Gigaloth. And it cantrips itself when it builds, so it's really not a bad card, and it's pretty sturdy, so it can stick around for Gigaloth plays as well as Progenitor plays. Great all-around body, pretty fat, wears buffs really nicely. Great card all in all. Definitely hold it as player 1. This will come up later, but just keep in mind, if you don't have flash in your opening hand, always hold this, because if they answer your turn 1, or you play a turn 1 build minion and you can't ramp it to 4, you're going to need a 3, and this is your only true development that you can do on 3, so just keep that in mind. 4 drops, pretty big, but it's fine. Just like, from 2-draw, there used to be a saying that you want a lot of 2s and a lot of 4s. That's your most important slot, because that's your turn 1 play and your turn 2 play after you ramp. So that's fine. And add in ramp, and you have even more flexibility. With flash, all of these guys, with the exception of Timekeeper, are perfectly fine turn 1 plays. Maybe Progenitor's a little iffy, but even then, 5/2, if you're opening against anything not called Vet, you can really threaten the center tile in a pinch. Not much else to say here. Progenitor combos very well with Lavalance. That was a big reason why I wanted to switch to Ragnora, outside of, the pressure of the Ripper. Simply because, Lavalance costs 1, and that's really not tempo negative, and it allows you to both develop and remove your opponent's board. Like, even without Progenitor, if you haven't played an egg, just think of it as, your general has 4 attack, and a lot of times that's enough to clear the 3-drop that they've put down, and enough to slow your opponent down before your build guys come online. So that's, I think, the main crux as to why I think Ragnora is superior, just because you have this combo. You can tempo out your opponent and put more pressure on them while still being able to develop threats of your own, which is something I don't think Starhorn can do. He can rebuke, and he can, natural selection, but again, natural selection really doesn't work with a deck centered around putting as many 0/10s on the board as possible. And it's, 2 mana, the difference between 1 and 2 mana is incredible. 1 mana really doesn't mess with your curve. 2 mana, you're going to start seeing some major kinks in how you choose to develop your threats. Partially because Lavalance is just so busted as it is, but that's a story for another time. Finally, rounding out the curve, we have Macantor Warbeast and Bounded Life Force. I know some decks don't run Macantor, and I think that's a mistake. It's probably the best card in the game. There's no reason why you shouldn't be running it in Magmar. It's a comeback mechanism. You can't rely on your high rolls. You have to consider, most of your games, you're not gonna, just roll over your opponent. You're going to have to grind through it, or you're gonna have a bad start. And Macantor can bring back games that you would have lost otherwise. No reason why you shouldn't do it. Also, even if your opponent answers threats in the beginning, I decided to throw in Bounded Life Force. For those of you newer guys around, Bounded Life Force used to be pretty popular back in the day, but it fell out of favor recently, which is understandable. Like, you don't really need to run it with Vath, just because people are already playing around Drogon. But with Ragnora, it's great because the enemy general usually has to stay in range of you anyway, because he needs to be close so he can use his opening Gambit minions a lot of times to deal with your Ripper. And the only time they're really going to be backing up is if they can't deal with the Rippers. And Frankly, that's usually not going to be a situation here, just because they're going to have to stay center if they want to deal with the build minions. So that's where Bounded Life Force comes in. You get a great Gigaloth turn. Let's say the opponent rebukes. Oh, it's okay. You did 15 damage. You can just chain Mechantors and then bound it at the end. And then, combine it with Repulsor Beast. Great. Speaking of which, Repulsor Beast. This is a tech slot. You could definitely run Rebuke if you feel like you're getting, tempoed out of the early game too easily. Or, Wander is too much of a problem. Or, just any big minion. Like, let's say you're going up against, Starhorn running, Visionar and Vindicator and High Respects and, all of these massive minions that you can't really keep up with. Rebuke's a perfectly fine option over Repulsor Beast. I run Repulsor Beast simply because usually I'm not dealing with big enough threats that my board can't deal with, just because the opponent is so under pressure to deal with the 0-10s that he's usually not putting something big on the board until it's too late. The only big thing that is an exception to this rule I found would be Wanderer, and even then that's a 7/7, so I really don't need an AoE to clear 1/7/7. I can, for 1 mana less, I can put a body on the board and effectively deal with it for the rest of the game. So that's where the Repulsor Beast comes in. Couple it in with the fact that it combos quite well with Kuhada and Flash. You can usually set up nice War Beasts as well as a bonus. So a very flexible card. That's why I included it. So overall, that's the deck. There's some other inclusions. I think I didn't really need to explain Jammer. It's a great 4-drop to slam. Keeps your hand size nice. Just because, unlike Starhorn, you can't rely on just T2K5 to keep your hand full. You need other ways. It's very good, and it does its job there. Best 4-drop in the game, in my opinion, just by virtue of its flexibility. One thing I will say is, when you are opening with this deck, I would prioritize looking for 2-drops over holding Jammer, unless you are playing against, say, Voth or a Magmar opponent. Simply because you win and lose by your opener. If you don't refill, it's not necessarily the end of the world, but having a slow start is what the deck lives and dies by. So prioritize your start over keeping your hand full. TK25 is usually enough to keep you through the early game. And then, remember, even if you get to the late game with only 3 cards in hand, it's not the end of the world. You can chain Mechantors, you have Lava Lance, you can Bounded Life Force. These are all expensive cards, and games usually aren't lasting more than 7 mana with this deck. So, yeah, pretty cool. Couple more notes that I have. Why this deck all of a sudden? Well, I really like this deck because it has a favored matchup against all the current top tier decks. Fault Xerix really can't tempo this guy out. Even with their Golem core as player 2, you on average will open better than they will. And their main removal, the only way they can really deal with the 0-10s, usually doesn't come online until it's too late. 5 mana Blood of Air, Sandswell Reader, it's usually not enough to deal with the onslaught of 0-10s you have. And, usually the Gigaloth has already hit, and Blood of Air is a turn too late. Aggro Riva, again, a pretty good matchup, especially if you're opening with RXs. Also, Lava Lance can deal with just about anything that she can put down, plus a general punch. Be wary of opening with Progenitor, just because they can Pando in or Focus. So just be aware of something like that. You're better off developing buildings if you can, just because Pando really can't deal with buildings. She's going to have to focus on pushing damage, which is basically a game of chicken. She has to trust that you don't have Timekeeper, and usually, if the player is good, that's usually not a risk they're going to take. Wanderer, again, Riva just gets stomped. She doesn't have any way to deal with 0-10s, especially the onslaught of stats that this thing can put out. Like, if you're putting out 3 0-10s in a turn, which you generally can as player 2, she's just not going to be able to keep up. She only has 2 removal, Onyx Bear and Bamboozle, And even then, those cost 3. That's a huge loss of tempo early game. And usually she's going to be under too much pressure to play Wanderer in this matchup. Ragnora is an even matchup, in my opinion, just because he has access to Plasma Storm. He has access to Natural Selection. And if his Rippers come online, they will shred your structures. Couple that with the fact that he can flash his Wanderer out. So usually he can play his Wanderer before he's under too much pressure. Really can make this, I would say, even. I have a very good win rate against current Wanderer Rags, but I also have to thank my lucky stars because I haven't really run into some of the big guns who really pioneered this deck, namely, our hacker, Rivrath. I haven't really run into them. So I'm anticipating it's an even matchup, even though I've, won pretty much all the matches Wander, Riva, or Ragnora has put against me. I'm just going to chalk that up to, not playing against the big guns just yet. If I end up queuing into Riv multiple times and I find, my openers are better or the matchup is just clearly favored, I'd be happy to revise my stance. But as of now, I see no reason to. I think it's a even matchup. And then finally, Ziran. Not much to say here. Lionar has always struggled with high health minions. They only have Martyrdom, and the current Lionar builds don't usually run Martyrdom. They might run Claim. Some of the late game Zirans will run Claim. I think that's a mistake, having played Ziran quite a bit myself. It usually comes online too late to deal with the things that Claim is meant to deal with. But at the same time, I don't really care if they run Claim. It'll slow their deck down, and usually the build minions come online before 7 mana, because she can't put out enough damage to deal with multiple 0/10s. So I'm not worried about that at all. Wow. Pardon me. I'm not editing that out. Alright, other strengths, it's unparalleled in its ability to put stats on the board, especially as player 2. Yeah, as I said before, this deck it's kind of like, Swarm Lilith. You can open with Wraith Swarm and, just play all your 2-drops and, Inkling Surge and all these things that, put like a billion minions on board, and the opponent just can't deal with that. This deck works very similar. You open with Kuhada and then, 3 of your 2-drops, which all cost 1. Like, you deny the opponent's ramp too, because you can summon that and the center. Like, how do you come back from that? You usually can't if you're not Vath. And even then, if you're player 1 as Vath, Plasma Storm is 3 turns away. You're usually not going to last till then. Those guys are going to hatch. Other reasons, as I said before, this deck works very much like a Swarm deck, which is why when I compare it to other decks, I usually will compare it to other Swarm decks, because that's its major selling point. That's how it plays. So yeah, as I said before, it's way more resilient than even the likes of Swarm Lionar, simply because, it's a 0/10 when it comes out, and then when the minion is built, it heals back everything to its, built stats. So just so much damage is wasted on trying to take down these structures, and then usually that's all for naught if you can play Timekeeper. You play, 2 of these a turn, starting turn 1 to turn 3. Your opponent's usually not going to be able to keep up, and you just run them into the ground. Add into the fact that buildings can't be dispelled, and you've got a really fierce combo. Like, you don't really have to worry about Lightbender as much. I mean, there are choice minions that can be dispelled. Mecantor, T2, K5 once it's built, as well as Spelljammer and even Gigaloth in a pinch. But again, like, these guys already have pretty decent bodies to begin with. Like, you dispel a Mecantor, you usually still have a 4/2 on the board that you either have to punch if your board is empty, or body block, which usually results in another trade. Gigaloth is still a 7/7, or 7/5 usually if you go face after it's been dispelled, and Jammer's a 3/5, so it's not going down that easily. And then finally, you have comeback mechanisms that don't really deter your ability to develop. Like I said before, you have the Progenitor Lance combo, and even then, on any BBS turn, for 2 mana less, you can, clear a minion and still develop something else. while developing, an egg and, another build structure. Like, you can't, it's very hard to stay on top of something like that without undergoing, extreme deficits in mana because you're playing under curve and playing, removal. And eventually your board suffers for it because you're run over by, this just overwhelming board. And then finally, you have Mercantor. As I said before, there's no reason why you shouldn't be running it in a deck like this. Great comeback mechanism, as well as a great final nail in the coffin if your opponent is turtling. And then finally, a lot of people will forget Timekeeper as a card, and they'll hold removal until the last minute, and usually only hit you when the build is won. And a lot of times, Timekeeper will mess with that timing, and it'll throw off their turns. Also, it's a great follow-up to an on-curve Gigaloth, just because you're going to put down the Timekeeper plus your BBS. So you have a 3/4 egg plus a 5/5 Timekeeper, and usually the Gigaloth will clear, whatever small minion they have, or just Ghost Face, and usually that board is too big to come back from. Finally, Bounded Life Force, again, as I said before. Even if you're not running this deck, but you enjoy running Ragnora, I highly recommend running Bounded Life Force, testing out 2, depending on how your draw engine is. It's a great card and will catch a lot of people off guard. I'm surprised more people aren't playing it, just because it's such a great way to catch your opponent into lethal by virtue of just trading in the board. Like, they think they're safe at 16. You have, let's say it's a combo deck. You have Ragebinder, you have maybe a Raptor or a Young Silithar. You just trade everything in and suddenly it's, a 15 damage lethal. Same principle applies here. A lot of times, the opponent will be forced to stay close to you just to deal with your build minions. And if 7 mana comes around and they're pretty low, usually Life Force will finish the game with you. Oh, and then finally is the game style. So like I said before, you do have a lot of tempo plays in terms of Lance, as well as Mercantor later on, and a great finisher in Life Force. But at the end of the day, your greatest tempo is just your ability to, develop 0/10s. Even the most aggressive deck will be forced to acknowledge your board and deal with it eventually, just because you will outvalue them and snowball them into the ground. Like Aggro Riva cannot stay in your face and ignore the 7/7 Gigaloth that's going to hatch the next turn. She either has to clear that Gigaloth or clear the rest of the board so that the Gigaloth doesn't get as much value. That's usually not an option. Like I said before, a lot of the heavy burn decks, Ziran and the like, they can't use Vitriol as effectively against you, simply because of all the 0/10s. They can take a lot of hits, and the pings aren't enough to kill you. Weaknesses. So the deck is not without its weaknesses. It's incredibly weak to other Magmar because they have access to Natural Selection and Plasma Storm. And as I said before, a dedicated Ragnora list often will beat you simply because they can open with things like Cryptographer, and if they're player 2, a Cryptographer and an egg, usually that means they can keep up with your structures because the Rippers will just destroy them. Regarding Vath, I think it's still salvageable. You hold Shroud for when he gets too big, and try not to overextend past 5 mana, because Plasma will wipe your board. But again, he's going to have to stay close to you. You can bait him into a Bounded Life Force. And even if he doesn't want to stay close to you, he has to, because if he backs up, he loses, because he's fat. Yeah, and then the final weakness is this deck is much weaker as player 1 than it is as player 2. You have a lot of awkward turns just because build structures can't ramp into 4. So my suggestion is always to hold T2K5 as player 1, unless you absolutely have to replace for a 2-drop, or you have a superior flash play, simply because it's the only thing you can really develop on turn 2 if you can't get that tile. And that's just about it. I have a couple cool hype games that I'll play. I won't really commentate on them. I hopefully will put out a video with more in-depth matches later. But yeah, this is the deck. Hopefully you liked it and enjoy the gameplay.